Stop for a minute.
Go.
Okay, go. Good morning, everyone. I'm Carol Fowler, a member of the Chatsworth Champions Committee, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you here today. Would you please turn off all electronic devices? And there are some committee members here today, too, that I would like you to be introduced to. Can you raise your hands if you're on the Chatsworth Champions? Oh, my goodness. I don't think I'll go along and give out all the names, but they're all hard workers for these wonderful programs. And before we greet Martha, I'd like to tell you about the subsequent program, which is next week on Wednesday, the 12th. Right here at 1:30, we're going to have a wine chats. The chat is a joint effort between author Lane Witherell, the River Grills, wine manager Sharon Hobson, Weatherbird, and the library. And wine expert Mr. Witherell will speak about his book, Wine Maniacs, Life in the Wine Biz. The first 40 attendees over the age of 21 will be invited to taste a few wines chosen by Ms. Hobson from Weatherbird's selections. Thank you for caring about animals and for your donations to the animal shelter. In addition to the items on its needs list, the shelter is attempting to raise funds to replace rusting animal cages, repair rotting ceilings, door frames, and leaking pipes. Volunteers, especially carpenters and plumbers, are warmly welcomed. If you were unable to bring a donation today but wish to help, there is a basket marked animal shelter on the table for cash donations. On to Martha. Writer and editor Martha White is E.B. White's granddaughter and literary executor. She'll talk to us about her latest book, E.B. White on Dogs. Maine Coast Book staff is here authoring Miss White's books and some of her grandfather's titles purchased and autographed after the program. Miss White lives on the coast of Maine. Her articles, book reviews, stories, and essays have appeared in the New York Times, Boston Globe, Christian Science Monitor, Country Journal, Remedies, Yankee, and many other national magazines. Her books include Traditional Home Remedies, The Letters of E.B. White, and In the Words of E.B. White. As most of you must know, E.B. White was the beloved author of Charlotte's Web, Stuart Little, Trumpet of the Swan, One Man's Meat, and columnist for the New Yorker for almost half a century. He inspired generations of writers and readers. In E.B. White on Dogs, Martha has compiled the best of his essays, poems, letters, and sketches, depicting over a dozen of White's various canine companions. Much of White's appeal is that he wrote about his pets as he might write about a person. In sum, this is a book for readers who enjoy a good sentence and a masterful turn of the phrase. For E.B. White fans looking for more from a favorite author, and for dog lovers who may not have discovered Mr. White's wit, style, and talent. Welcome back to Skidompha, Martha. Thank
you. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you to Carol Fowler and Pam at the library here and Lincoln County Rescue Shelter for doing what they do. It's been a nice bonus of this dog book project that we've been able to link with a lot of rescue shelters and places, mostly in New England, but all over as part of these readings and talks. And so that was kind of unexpected, but a very nice piece of it, which I hadn't thought about when I was putting together the book. I should tell you first, these photos that I'm going to show along with, I'm going to read various sections from the book, mostly excerpts as just teasers of a little bit of an idea of what's in the book. But you'll notice as I go along in the photos, most of them are old family photos. Some of them were terrible photos to begin with. They're certainly some out of focus and badly damaged over the years, and I'm not a professional photographer by any means, so I apologize when some of the photos look less than perfect. The cover ones are the best ones, so they're going to be deteriorate as we go through. So just to know that, don't think it's anything to do with Skidompha or the tech crew here who've been wonderful at getting this up and going. I show this this cover of the previous book that I put together only because it was really the start of E.B. White on Dogs. When I put together the quotations book, in the words of E.B. White, for Cornell University Press a few years ago, everything was organized according to subject title and alphabetically. And when I got to the section on dogs, I noticed it was getting very long. There were just way too many quotations. It was out of proportion to the rest of the book. And so I thought, well, this is just because I'm a dog lover myself. I have golden retrievers. It's a subject I like. So I started sticking them in a manila folder, thinking, well, I'll just go back at the end and pick out the best of the best and put them in the book, and that'll be the end of it. Well, the folder got quite large, and I realized as I was going along that E.B. White had really written a lot about dogs, and much of it had not been collected into the essays and other volumes, partly because many of them were very short pieces. There were notes and comment pieces or little squibs. But some of them were just, I thought, wonderful. And so once I got through the quotations book, I took the folder of dog bits and went over to Tilbury House, which at that point was still in Gardner, and talked to Jennifer Bunting about possibly a dog project. She had a dog in the office, and she had also worked for a short time for my grandfather in Brooklyn. So it took her about 2 minutes. She said, absolutely, and we were off on another book project. So that was the beginning of the dog book. When I came along, I'm a toddler in this shot. My grandfather was born in 1899, so he was 55 when I was born, and I was about 30 when he died in 1985. So I knew him in Maine. They had already long since moved to Maine full-time. They still worked for the New Yorker. Both he and my grandmother, Catherine, still worked for the New Yorker really all their lives. But they did it from Maine at the point that I knew him. They had come up and bought a piece of land in the 30s, started coming summers, and then by the time my father was about 7, he was in grammar school in Maine, and very happy about that. And my grandfather was certainly very happy to be here. And there were times when they went back and forth. In the 40s and wartime, they went back to New York fairly often because there were so many of the staff members that were called off to the war effort. But essentially, they were in Maine from the late 30s on and really full-time from the mid-40s. But my grandfather he was born and raised in Mount Vernon, New York. This is his parents, Jessie Hart White and Samuel Tilly White. And they had 6 children. Elwyn, my grandfather, was the youngest of the 6. And as far as I can tell, there hadn't been dogs in the family until he came along. And of course, there were dogs in the neighborhood, and he loved all sorts of animals. He kept squabs and rabbits and various things. But what he really wanted was a dog, but it took a little convincing, especially for his father, to consent to the first dog. This dog is Beppo. I'm not sure where he came in the lineup, but I don't think he was Elwyn's dog, but maybe a neighborhood dog, I'm not sure. But I'm going to start by reading a little piece from an essay in One Man's Meat called Dog Training. And it'll give you the sense of what it was like for E.B. to try to convince his father that they needed a dog. In my suburban town, respectable people didn't keep she-dogs. One's washerwoman might keep a bitch or one's lawn cutter, but certainly not one's next-door neighbor. The prejudice against females made a deep impression on me, and I grew up thinking that there was something indecent and unclean about she-things in general. The word bitch, of course, was never used in polite families. One day, a little mutt followed me home from school, and after much talk, I persuaded my parents to let me keep it, at least until the owner turned up or advertised for it. It dwelt among us only one night. Next morning, my father took me aside and in a low voice said, "My son, I don't know whether you realize it, but that dog is a female. It'll have to go." "But why does it have to?" I asked. "They're a nuisance," he replied, embarrassed. "We'd have all the other dogs in the neighborhood around here all the time." That sounded like an idyllic arrangement to me, but I could tell from my father's voice that the stray dog was doomed. We turned her out and she went off toward the more liberal section of town. So that was the first struggle. Evie's father, Samuel, he was a piano man, but he was also the inspiration for the character in the Trumpet of the Swan. If any of you have read Trumpet of the Swan, Louis the Swan's father, the old cog, was modeled on Elwyn's father, and he would take 20 words to say something you could say in 6, and that was Samuel. So this is the really Elwyn's first dog, Mac, an old-style collie, and again I'm going to read another excerpt from Dog Training about Mac. A really companionable and indispensable dog is an accident of nature. You can't get it by breeding for it, and you can't buy it with money. It just happens along. Out of the vast sea of assorted dogs that I have had dealings with, by far the noblest, the best, and the most important was the first, the one my sister sent me in a crate. He was an old-style collie, beautifully marked, with a blunt nose and a great natural gentleness and intelligence. When I got him, he was what I badly needed. I think probably all these other dogs of mine have been just a groping toward that old dream. I've never dared get another collie for fear the comparison would be too uncomfortable. I can still see my first dog and all the moods and mutations that memory has filed him away in, but I think of him oftenest as it used to be right after breakfast on the back porch, listlessly eating up a dish of petrified oatmeal rather than hurt my feelings. For 6 years he met me at the same place after school and convoyed me home, a service he thought up himself. A boy doesn't forget that sort of association. It is a monstrous trick of fate that now, settled in the country and with sheep to take care of, I'm obliged to do my shepherding with the grotesque and sometimes underhanded assistance of 2 dachshunds and a wire-haired fox terrier. So this is Elwyn at Cornell, so he was about 18 or 20. Both his brothers had gone to Cornell. They went from Mount Vernon on the train to Ithaca. And so, of course, those were dogless years, but wonderful years for my grandfather. He became editor of the Cornell Daily Sun and was off as a writer, I think. And then first, right after Cornell, he made a cross-country trip to the West Coast in an old Model T, and made his way up to Alaska in a ship and then came back. And when he first got back to New York City, it was Depression days, really, 1928 or so. So first he went to work in an advertising agency, which he completely hated, and he worked for the United Press, which he thought he was really very bad at. He wasn't good at quick deadlines. But he was freelancing and sending things out, and in a short while, my grandmother, Catherine, who was working then for the New Yorker, noticed something that he had written in the conning tower and wrote him a note and asked him if he would come in and meet them and think about coming on the staff. So that was how he met the woman that would become my grandmother. And he started part-time at the New Yorker and then full-time, I think about 1928 or 29. So his office mate was James Thurber. He had met James Thurber at a party just casually, and they were looking for more staff, and he had dropped his name as a humorist that he knew and he liked something that he'd read of his. So they ended up sharing an office together and also shared a kind of quirky sense of humor, which resulted first in my grandfather's first book called Is Sex Necessary, which of course mortified Jesse and Samuel Tilly White, who were so embarrassed. It was full of Thurber cartoons, and it was really a spoof on some of the psychology sex manuals of the day. Kind of an outdated title today, but a fairly amusing one. But James Thurber also had dogs. He had a Scotty dog named Jeannie. That's my grandmother with Thurber and Jeannie, and then before long there were pups. So of course my grandparents had to take one of the pups, and as was true to form for my grandfather, he chose the run of the litter, and they named her Daisy. So I'm going to read a piece about Daisy. As far as I know, Daisy was the only dog who ever had an obituary in the New Yorker. She had a short life, but an interesting one. And I'm going to read you part of the obituary. This is in the New Yorker, March 12th, 1932. Obituary. Daisy, Black Watch Debatable, died December 22, 1931, when she was hit by a yellow cab in University Place. At the moment of her death, she was smelling the front of a florist shop. It was a wet day, and the cab skidded up over the curb, just the sort of excitement that would have amused her had she been at a safe distance. She is survived by her mother, Jeannie, a brother, Abner, her father, whom she never knew, and 2 sisters, whom she never liked. She was 3 years old. Daisy was born at 65 West 11th Street in a clothes closet at 2 o'clock on a December morning in 1928. She came, as did her sisters and brothers, as an unqualified surprise to her mother, who had for several days previously looked with a low-grade suspicion on the box of bedding that had been set out for her delivery, and who had gone into the clothes closet merely because she had felt funny and wanted a dark, awkward place to feel funny in. Daisy was the smallest of the litter of 7 and the oddest. Her life was full of incident, but not of accomplishment. Persons who knew her only slightly regarded her as an opinionated little bitch, and said so. But she had a small circle of friends who saw through her, cost what it did. At Speyer Hospital, where she used to go when she was indisposed, she was known as Whitey, because, the man told me, she was black. All her life she was subject to moods, and her feelings about horses laid her sanity open to question. Once she slipped her leash and chased a horse for 3 blocks through the heavy traffic, in the carking belief that she was an effective agent against horses. Drivers of teams, seeing her only in the moments of her delirium, invariably leaned far out of their seats and gave tongue, mocking her, and thus made themselves even more ridiculous for the moment than Daisy. She had a stoical nature and spent the latter part of her life an invalid, owing to an injury to her right hind leg. Like many invalids, she developed a rather objectionable cheerfulness, as though to deny that she had cause for rancor. She also developed, without instruction or encouragement, a curious habit of holding people firmly by the ankle without actually biting them, a habit that gave her an immense personal advantage and won her many enemies. As far as I know, she never even broke the thread of a sock, so delicate was her grasp, like a retriever's, but her point of view was questionable, and her attitude was beyond explaining to the person whose ankle was at stake. For my own amusement, I often tried to diagnose this quirkish temper, and I think I understand it. She suffered from a chronic perplexity, and it relieved her to take hold of something. And I often say, I think that was true of my grandfather. I think he also suffered from a chronic perplexity, and his relief was in the writing about it. When he wrote about his dogs or any of the subjects, he was often figuring out something that was on his mind. I'm not going to read this poem, and it has nothing to do with dogs, but I put it up there only to demonstrate how awestruck my grandfather was at the impending arrival of his firstborn. My grandmother, Catherine, had been previously married to Ernest Angel, so she had 2 children when they met, Nancy and Roger Angel. But my grandfather had not been married before and had not had children, so when he heard from my grandmother that spring that they were about to have a baby, he found it a little difficult to put his feelings into words. So I'm going to read you a letter that was written to my grandmother. This is my grandmother with Daisy and my father Joel in the pram. The letter is to my grandmother, but my grandfather, rather than writing it from his own point of view, he used Daisy as the vehicle to say what he couldn't say himself, so a literary device. So this is spring of 1930, letter to Catherine S. White. And you need to know also, Josephine is mentioned in the piece. She's the cook, and according to my grandfather, she was the only woman he'd ever met who, when a dog was sick on the floor and it was her job to clean it up, she would feel sorry for the dog. Spring 1930. Dear Mrs. White, I like having Josephine here in the morning, although I suppose I will get less actual thinking done, as I used to do my thinking mornings in the bathroom. White has been stewing around for 2 days now, a little bit worried because he is not sure that he's made you realize how glad he is that there is to be what the column writer in the Mirror calls a blessed event. So I am taking this opportunity, Mrs. White, to help him out to the extent of writing you a brief note, which I haven't done in quite a long time, but have been a little sick myself, as you know. Well, the truth is, White is beside himself and would have said more about it, but is holding himself back, not wanting to appear ludicrous to a veteran mother. What he feels, he told me, is a strange, queer, tight, little twitchy feeling around the inside of his throat whenever he thinks that something is happening which will require so much love, and all on account of you being so wonderful. I am not making myself clear, I'm afraid, but on the occasions when White has spoken privately with me about this, he was in no condition to make himself clear either, and I am just doing the best I can in my own way. I know White so well that I always know what is the matter with him, and it always comes to the same thing. He gets thinking that nothing that he writes or says ever quite expresses his feeling, and he worries about his inarticulateness, just the same as he does about his bowels, except it is worse, and it makes him either mad or sick or with a prickly sensation in his head. But my, last Sunday he was so full of this matter, which he couldn't talk about, and he was what Josephine would call hoppy, and particularly so because it seemed so good that everything was starting at once. I mean those things, whatever they are, that are making such a noise over in the pond by Palmer Lewis's house, and the song sparrow that even I could hear from my confinement, and those little seeds that you were sprinkling up where the cut glass and bones used to be, all starting at the same time as the baby, which he seems to think exists already by the way he stands around staring at you and muttering little prayers. Of course, he is also very worried for fear you will get the idea that he is regarding you merely as a future mother and not as a present person, or that he wants a child merely as a vindication of his vanity. I doubt if those things are true. White enjoys animal husbandry of all kinds, including his own, and as for his regard for you, he has told me that quite apart from this fertility, he admires you in all kinds of situations or dilemmas, some of which he says have been quite dirty. I'll leave it there. I think that last comment was a reference to her gardening, but I can't be sure. She was quite a gardener. Let's see. Oh, this is Nancy and Roger with Joel, the toddler, and the dog is Moses. The photo gives you the idea that maybe Nancy wasn't as much of a dog lover as the rest of them, or maybe the dog was just wet, I don't know. She seems to be holding it, maybe not by her own volition. And this is really when they got to Maine full time. This is probably early 40s when he was writing the One Man's Meat columns for Harper's. When he first came to Maine, he dropped back from doing some of the New Yorker weekly columns that he had been doing, and very thankfully did a monthly column for Harper's Magazine, and it was those columns that became the One Man's Meat collection, which I still think today is the best of his work. It's when he was first farming and learning how to farm from his neighbors here in Maine, and very happy with the world in general. The One Man's Meat title is also a Tilbury House publication in the paperback edition. And this dog is Minnie, who is much more photographed than Fred. Fred and Minnie were both dachshunds and they were contemporaries, but Fred only has a couple of terrible photos of him, even though he was often written about. This is Raffles with my father, who's probably 9 or 10 in this photo. And Raffles, as the name suggests, was won at a raffle by my grandfather and brought home, I'm sure to my father's delight. He was a wire-haired terrier, and I thought I would read one of the obedience contest pieces to go with this. My grandfather, when he was at the New Yorker, they were smart about letting him sort of come and go whenever he wanted to, and one of the things he loved to do was go to the dog shows and report on them. So there are 2 or 3 pieces in here about dog shows, and this is one of them. February 22, 1947, Dog Show Obedience Contest. Last night to Madison Square Garden to watch the obedience contest in the dog show, and it resulted in a 15-0 victory for obedience, the Boston Terrier abstaining. It did not seem to me, though, that this dog's abstention indicated a lack of cooperation or even a contempt for obedience, but simply that the Boston Terrier's mind was on other matters, which from my own experience is where a Boston Terrier's mind is more than 90% of the time. The dog show is the only place I know of where you can watch a lady go down on her knees in public to show off the good points of a dog, thus obliterating her own. That may be my favorite line in the book. So there's another piece about Boston Terriers, which was a one-man speak column from 1939. I'm going to read just the beginning of it, but it had to do with a Camel cigarette ad. I would like to hand down a dissenting opinion in the case of the Camel ad that shows a Boston Terrier relaxing. I can string along with cigarette manufacturers to a certain degree, but when it comes to the temperament and habits of terriers, I shall stand my ground. The ad says, "A dog's nervous system resembles our own." I don't think a dog's nervous system resembles my own in the least. A dog's nervous system is in a class by itself. If it resembles anything at all, it resembles the Consolidated Edison Company's power plant. This is particularly true of Boston Terriers, and if the Camel people don't know that, they have never been around dogs. The ad says, "But when a dog's nerves tire, he obeys his instincts. He relaxes." This, I admit, is true. But I should like to call attention to the fact that it sometimes takes days, even weeks, before a dog's nerves tire. In the case of terriers, it can run into months. I knew a Boston Terrier once. He is now dead, and so far as I know, relaxed. His nerves stayed keyed up from the 25th of one June to the 6th of the following July, without 1 minute's peace for anybody in the family. He was an old dog, and he was blind in one eye, but his infirmities caused no diminution in his nervous power. During the period of which I speak, the famous period of his greatest excitation, he not only raised a type of general hell that startled even his closest friends and observers, but he gave a mighty clever excuse. He said it was love. "I'm in love," he would scream. He would scream just like a hurt child. "I'm in love and I'm going crazy." I'm not sure if that was about Raffles or not. Let's see. Well, more than the Terriers, there were Dachshunds, and I think Fred and Minnie actually shared the household at the same time as Fred, as Raffles, at least for a period of time. This is a photo again of Minnie in the New Yorker office, and I love this photo because it almost looks like she's got a cigarette hanging out of her mouth. She doesn't, but it reminded me of the beginning of the dog training essay, which is really about Fred. My grandfather wrote, "There is a book out called Dog Training Made Easy, and it was sent to me the other day by the publisher, who rightly guessed that it would catch my eye. I like to read books on dog training. Being the owner of Dachshunds, to me a book on dog discipline becomes a volume of inspired humor. Every sentence is a riot. Someday, if I ever get a chance, I shall write a book or warning on the character and temperament of the Dachshund and why he can't be trained and shouldn't be. I would rather train a striped zebra to balance an Indian club than induce a Dachshund to heed my slightest command. For a number of years past, I have been agreeably encumbered by a very large and dissolute Dachshund named Fred. Of all the dogs whom I have served, I've never known one who understood so much of what I say or held it in such deep contempt. When I address Fred, I never have to raise either my voice or my hopes. He even disobeys me when I instruct him in something that he wants to do. And when I answer his peremptory scratch at the door and hold the door open for him to walk through, he stops in the middle and lights a cigarette. I think any of us who've had dogs, and sometimes cats, have seen that body language. Let's see. This is Fred. These are the two photos that we do have of Fred. And Fred was often on a tether because he just could not resist the porcupine. So let's see. I'm going to read you. This is, again, an excerpt from a longer essay. It's from Bedfellows, which is one of my favorite of the longer essays in the book. fairly well-known one, and it kind of goes back and forth between the Democrats and the Dachshunds from the vantage point of my grandfather's sickbed. But this part is about Fred. He writes, "Fred devoted his life to deflating me and succeeded admirably. His attachment to our establishment, though untinged with affection, was strong nevertheless and vibrant. It was simply that he found in our persons, in our activities, the sort of complex, disorderly society that fired his imagination and satisfied his need for tumult and his quest for truth. After he had subdued 6 or 7 porcupines, we realized that his private war against porcupines was an expensive bore, so we took to tying him, making him fast to any tree or wheel or post or log that was at hand, to keep him from sneaking off into the woods. I think of him as always at the end of some outsized piece of rope. Fred's disgust at these confinements was great, but he improved his time nonetheless in 1,000 small diversions. He never just lay and rested. Within the range of his tether, he continued to explore, dissect, botanize, conduct post-mortems, excavate, experiment, expropriate, savor, masticate, regurgitate. He had no contemplative life, but he held as a steady gleam the belief that under the commonplace stone and behind the unlikely piece of driftwood lay the stuff of high adventure and the opportunity to save the nation." And again, that's a phrase that I often think related to my grandfather as well, that he really used the commonplace moments, the shingling of the barn or the dipping of the sheep, to talk about much larger issues that were going on in the day, you know, freedom, democracy, and preserving the trains and that sort of thing. He really chose those small moments to say what he had to say. Let's see, this is Augie. Augie was a dachshund that we knew as grandchildren. He was famous for swimming because his tail would go in circles like a propeller, and he could really move through the water, which you wouldn't think dachshunds would be able to do. He was also famous for sitting under the piano at Thanksgivings and Christmases. He would pick out the certain high notes that he particularly liked, and then he would sing, which of course we would ask for every Thanksgiving. We would want to have him do that again. He also would do anything from academia, which, if you come to think of it, the grandchildren did as well, so it was kind of nip and tuck who was going to get them. Let's see, I think I'll read another little bit about Fred, and then we'll wind it up pretty quick. This particular little passage is from an essay called A Week in November. It was written in 1942, and again, it was a one-man's meet piece, but it's about Fred getting older. Monday, notice this evening how gray Fred is becoming, our elderly dachshund. His trunk and legs are still red, but his muzzle, after dozens of major operations for the removal of porcupine quills, is now a sort of strawberry roan with many white hairs, the result of worry. Next to myself, he is the greatest worrier and schemer on the premises, and always has too many things on his mind. He not only handles all his own matters, but he has a follow-up system by which he checks on all of mine to see that everything is taken care of. His interest in every phase of farming remains undiminished, as does mine, but his passion for details is a kind of obsession and seems to me unhealthy. He wants to be present in a managerial capacity at every event, no matter how trifling or routine. It makes no difference whether I am dipping a sheep or simply taking a bath myself. He is a fire buff whose blaze is anything at all. In damp weather, his arthritis makes stair climbing a torturous and painful accomplishment, yet he groans his way down cellar with me to pack eggs and to investigate for the 1000th time the changeless crypt where the egg crates live. Here he awaits the fall of an egg to the floor and the sensual delight of licking it up, which he does with lips drawn slightly back as though in distaste at the strange consistency of the white. His hopes run always to accidents and misfortunes, the broken egg, the spilt milk, the wounded goose, the fallen lamb, the fallen cake. He also has an insane passion for a kicked football and a Roman candle, either of which can throw him into a running fit from which he emerges exhausted and frothing at the mouth. He can block a kick, or he can drop back and receive one full on the nose and run it back 10 or 12 yards. His activities and his character constitute an almost uninterrupted annoyance to me, yet he is such an engaging old fool that I'm quite attached to him in a half-regretful way. Life without him would be heaven, but I'm afraid it is not what I want. And this was a Christmas card in 1950 with a little verse that my grandparents sent out. And I think I won't read, I often read with it a piece called Architects and Dachshunds, which is about old New England houses and how the stairs don't always fit the dachshunds. And it's a beautiful piece of descriptive writing. I'll just recommend it to you rather than read it, about the conniptions involved in the dachshund going downstairs. And of course, as grandchildren, we remember particularly Augie going down the stairs. There were two sets of stairs in my grandfather's house. The front set were fairly leisurely and the dogs could navigate them easily, but the steps that went to the kitchen were very steep and had a turn at the bottom. And so as kids, we would run through the hall upstairs, go down the kitchen stairs, and the dog would stop abruptly at the top of the kitchen stairs and turn tail and head to the other set of stairs. And we would race to see who would meet at the bottom first. And the dog was almost always in the kitchen before we were. And this is Maggie. This is probably 70s, like maybe 77 or 75. Maggie was a little collie dog, so my grandfather did break his promise to himself of never getting another collie for fear it wouldn't live up to Mac. Maggie was a beagle collie rescue, and she eventually came to live at our house because as she got older, she was fairly boisterous and kept jumping up on my grandmother, and by then my grandmother's skin was very delicate and couldn't take it. So we ended up adopting Maggie at our house, and she was a wonderful docile dog. She in the introduction to the book, I tell a story about a nest of ducklings that I had when Maggie came to live with us, and Maggie would come out every morning to see the hatching of these ducklings, and they imprinted on her. So one of them got to where it would actually ride on her back, and she was perfectly willing to let it do that. She would just walk down to the pond and know that it would get off, if it got really off. And then after Maggie were a series of small dogs. There was Jones and another called Red, and then a West Highland Terrier called Susie, and all fairly neurotic. Jones was particularly neurotic. He was rescued from somebody in Maine, but had been originally brought over from England in a crate on an airplane, and I don't think it did him any good. He was a very nervous dog, and as my grandfather wrote, he was peppery, scrappy, and canny, and semi-obedient. I think I can make a dog of him yet, but I don't think he really did quite make a dog of him. he had various problems. There's one piece that I will read. It's a letter to Phillip Hughes, and it describes these final dogs. Phillip Hughes had written evidently to ask about Norwich Terriers, but also had mentioned that he was no longer a subscriber to the New Yorker. So the letter starts, "Dear Mr. Hughes, sorry to hear that you are a dropout, but grateful for your letter and glad you can still read. Wish I could still write. My Norwich Terrier will be 7 in May. His club name is Jay's Green Rusty, United Kingdom, and he was sired, it says here, by a dog named Hunston Horseradish. He is known in this house as Jones, and is seldom found more than 6 feet from where I am. He is a neurotic, scarred as a puppy by being shoved into a crate for a plane trip from England, then another plane trip from Boston to Maine. I think somebody along the way must have hit him with a stick, because even after all these years with me, I can't pick up a fly swatter without his cringing. I got him from Sylvia Warren, and he almost never made it up out of his bed of neuroses. But he and I are enough alike so that we get on well, and I can't help being touched by his loyalty, which I think in this case is simply insecurity. He would never take a prize at a show, either would I, come to think of it. I have another terrier, a West Highland White, or off-white, named Susie. She is as open and outgiving as Jones is closed and reserved. Everybody loves Susie. Everybody tries to like Jones. But Jones takes his guard duties seriously and has made several attempts to kill people he thought were intruding. He particularly distrusts women in trousers and drivers of panel trucks, small children, and stray dogs. He has hunted squirrels for 6 years without bagging one. Susie is quicker than he is and once nabbed a barn swallow on the wing. Sometimes I dream of owning another Norwich, one that looks like a Norwich and behaves like one, but I am known for my outsized dreams. Meanwhile, I'm grateful for small favors like the little brown one over there on the sofa. Sincerely, E.B. White. Now, this is on the shore at Elm Cove. And you can barely see there, but the dog on the left that's white is Susie. She's kind of camouflaged by the snow, and it's not a great photo. But Susie was a sweet dog, and as he said, always off-white. She was always getting into the manure pile or the pond or the swamp or something, so she was bathed often. And I think this is red. It was hard to tell red and Jones apart in the photos, but this is early 80s, and I'm pretty sure it's red. My grandfather had an eye patch then because he was beginning to lose his eyesight, at least in one eye. He had macular degeneration, so that's what the eye patch was about. And that's the end. I'm going to leave it at that.
Oh.
Thank you. I will take a few question and answers if you have questions, or we can go